John, thank you. Well, John, thank you. And I wanted to first thank the Association of Military Reporters and Editors. I know that I stand between you and liberty, so I will make sure that I get through my comments quickly, and then I want to get to your questions. I want to begin by emphasizing how extraordinarily important transparency is with the military and the press corps. And I know from time to time that kind of waxes and wanes depending on who's in charge in the Pentagon, but as Congress makes the case for resources to be devoted to this nation's military, it's incredibly important that the American people know what the needs are, how do we meet those needs, what are the threats, and we don't have to get into the details of that, but I think it's incredibly important that people know that, because as we find ourselves in what I call resource-challenged environments, it's going to be extraordinarily important for people to know, why is it that we need to be spending this money? What does it need to be spent on? Why does the Navy need this? Why does the Army need this? What are our adversaries doing? How do we understand all of those pieces that come together? And I understand the nature in the Pentagon is that a lot of the things that they deal with are classified. So the tendency is to say, let's not put that information out there. I would argue in today's world, though, that it's incredibly important, especially with what our adversaries do and the things that they try to obtain. And some folks would say, well, listen, we don't want to let anything be known because our adversaries will use that against us. You look in today's world, folks, there are millions of bits of data that stream every day. And don't think that our adversaries don't take a vacuum cleaner and vacuum that up. And don't think that they won't use their means, whether it's artificial intelligence or whatever, to be able to figure things out. I argue that it's incredibly important that they know the seriousness which this nation pursues defending itself and its interests around the world. Those things, I think, are incredibly important. So I want to emphasize how I think the press, the military press specifically, plays a role in getting information out there, especially about provoking new thought. And I think we're in one of those points right now. I really think that we're at that tipping point where you look at how all of our service branches will have to operate. They will operate in multiple domains. It will not be just kinetics. It's going to be in the cyber realm. It's going to be in space. And I think all of the service branch chiefs are really looking at that. I just had a great conversation a couple of days ago with General Goldfein. They are going to be redirecting resources towards looking at what happens in those multiple domains. Those things are incredibly important. If you look at General Berger coming in as the new Commandant of the Marine Corps, what did he say? He says, listen, we have got to look at what the Marine Corps will be facing, not just tomorrow, but a year down the road, 2 years down the road, and really rethink what the Marine Corps does. What is forcible entry going to look like? What are the capabilities that we need? Are the legacy systems that are there really going to meet the need? The same with the Army and the same with the Navy. Those things are incredibly important. Having a dialogue to be able to discover where the possibilities lie to address those challenges, I think is incredibly important and must happen. I think anybody that's afraid of having those discussions doesn't understand where all of us need to be to make sure that we have, I think, the right perspective on the things that absolutely have to happen. And one of those areas, you know, is we looked at what happened with the two collisions of the Fitzgerald and the McCain. One of the elements there that's incredibly important is to look at, you know, what's the outcome of that? What are some of the things that need to happen? One of the recommendations that I had was to make sure that in-service, that is the inspections that take place on our ships, were made public. You know, for years they were public and then they went to the point of being classified. And listen, I understand you don't want to give away elements of vulnerability in systems. But I think that you do have to make the argument because, again, we are competing for resources to say, listen, here's the material condition of our ships. Here are the resources that have to be devoted to make that happen. Here's the capacity that needs to exist within the industry. Here's what our shipyards need to do. The only way that you're going to be able to do that is to have that discussion, to put out there to say, wow, there's some issues with the material condition of our ships. Let's get those things done. I want the public to understand that. I think Congress needs to understand that. That's the only way that decisions get made. If not, what happens is delay upon delay upon delay. And there is an external element of priorities that have to be created within the Pentagon. You know, a lot of it tends to look internally and say, well, we're the best determiner of what's needed. I say a lot of times, externally, there needs to be a little bit of pressure put on to make things happen. Think about the things that needed to happen that would not have happened without external pressure, and in turn, Congress. Where would we be with early introduction of UAVs? It was Congress and external pressures that said, let's pursue the effort on UAVs. What about MRAPs? MRAPs would not have happened if there wasn't external pressure to say, hey, what's going on there in Iraq? What's going on subsequently in Afghanistan? What are we doing to protect the troops? Congress said, hey, I don't care, Pentagon, what you want. This is what you are going to do. Those things are incredibly important. I would argue even more important today, especially as our adversaries adapt and flex to the surroundings that they see with near-peer adversaries. And we have to be able to do the same thing. And in order to do that, we have to make sure that we are making the argument to the American people, because some of these directions are going to be challenging. You're looking at, well, why are we going in this direction? What are we doing? What do we hope to achieve here? Why aren't we using that legacy system anymore? Why are we saying that we don't need that anymore? Because listen, there are interests there, and there are interests in my district with these legacy systems. Everyone is going to have to understand what the future holds, and making sure that we have that discussion and explaining where we are, why we need to be going down these paths, I think are incredibly important. I think too, if you look at some of the risks that we take out there, the way that we best manage risk is to make sure there's transparency as to what those risks are for the military and how do we address those risks. You look at today's systems operations, and you look at the risk of tardiness, I'll call it, in getting those systems operationalized. If you look at our adversaries who start with a blank sheet of paper and said, okay, let's get something out there that will put U.S. interest or U.S. forces at risk. They start with a blank sheet of paper. They can go in a lot of different directions. Things happen pretty quickly. If you look at where we are, what happens? There is an extraordinarily layered bureaucracy within the Pentagon. And when you go to start something new or try to introduce a new idea or try to innovate or create, what do you start with? You start with a sheet of paper that's not blank, where you can put ideas on there and work through and take some risks and fail and then move on and learn from those failures. What happens? You have this whole sheet of paper that's filled with no's. No, you can't do this. No, you can't do that. No, you can't do this. So what do you have to do? You have to find little portals there where you don't have a no to try to be able to pursue things. I think it's incredibly important that we look at how do we take that eraser and erase a lot of those no's. How do we get away from a checklist mentality in the Pentagon? And I asked the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Esper, about that, and I think he feels the same as many of us do, and that is an impediment that has to quickly move out of the way, because the legacy ways of doing acquisition, the legacy ways of making decisions, the legacy ways of adapting and flexing to a pretty dynamic environment are a thing of the past. And listen, I understand how large organizations operate, and it's not unique to the Pentagon. We see other organizations operate the same way. But what are the most successful organizations, or what do the most successful organizations have in common? The ability to change quickly, to explore concepts, to explore innovation and creation, to look at it and go, hey, that works, let's develop it, or hey, that doesn't work, let's move on, let's fail quickly. It sounds easy, it sounds like a great concept, but in large organizations it's extraordinarily difficult to get into place because there's that mindset. I argue that the way to most quickly get large organizations, whether it's the entire Pentagon or whether it's the service branches or whether it's the hierarchical leadership structure there to change, is to make sure there's not only an internal push, but that there's an external push to say, well, wait a minute, Pentagon, what are you doing? What are you doing to respond to the risks that we see around us? How are you making sure that the resources that are going there are being used with maximum utility to address these things? And I think that's incredibly important. I think the leadership in the Pentagon gets it. The question is how do you make that happen from Secretary Esper all the way down to the Lance Corporal there that's out training, or the private that's out there training with his brigade combat team, or the new third-class seaman that's on board the ship, learning his duty station there on board the ship. How do we get it from top to bottom? I think that those things absolutely have to happen if we are going to do the things that we have to do. Let me talk a little bit about current situation. One of the elements that is critically important with creating the scenario for these things to happen is for Congress to do its job. And unfortunately, Congress has not. If you look at the incredibly inefficient decision-making that takes place, and it's known as continuing resolutions, we waste a tremendous amount of money. If you look just at the Secretary of the Navy, said the previous 9 CRs, previous to last year, the previous 9 CRs resulted in the United States Navy wasting $4 billion. He said that's not delaying $4 billion, that's taking $4 billion and putting it into a trash can and burning it. If you were to dream up a way not to run an organization, if you were to dream up a way not to run a business, what would you come up with? A continuing resolution. And Congress, unfortunately, advocates its responsibility, continues to kick the can down the road, which I think is unbelievably bad policy. I get criticized because I vote against continuing resolutions, and I vote against them because I tell folks, you know, that is the definition of idiocy, doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Somewhere you've got to change. And listen, I don't want to shut the government down. That's ridiculously stupid also. But what do you do to be able to get things to change? I think there are a couple of things that have to happen. I think one of those things is members of Congress have to be at the front of suffering the consequences of inaction. So I think things like making sure a budget gets adopted by the 15th of April, which is a responsibility of the Congress. If not, members of Congress's paychecks should be withheld. Remember, they can't be taken away, but they can be withheld. You can put that money to an escrow account and say, by the way, you don't get it until you get your job done. Another incredibly archaic process in Washington is August recess. What business would say, okay, staff, leave town for 5 weeks. We got all this stuff to do, and we know when we get back, we're going to have 13 days left to do this massive amount of work. Guess what? Go home, have fun, do whatever you want. We'll come back, and we know we're not going to get it done in 13 days, so we just kick the can down the road again because it is built in that expectation. I think time at home ought to be earned. I think the bottom line is this: if you don't get all 12 appropriations bills done out of the House by the end of July, you don't get to go home. And guess what, folks? It works. Not this year, but the year before. What did Mitch McConnell do? He kept the Senate in town. And guess what happened? Miraculously, all 12 appropriations bills got out of committee and actually got to a point where they were substantive enough to accelerate the process. And guess what happened? We got an appropriations bill out on time. It can be done. It can be done, and the example is there if members of Congress will be held accountable. I think all of those things, your pay, your vacation, all need to be earned. And if not, then we find ourselves in this continual process of doing the same thing over and over again. So I am hopeful. I actually have 2 pieces of legislation in to do that. I wish I could tell you that I had a bunch of people that were signing on to it and saying, oh, this is great. But that is indeed not the case. But I will continue to fight along those lines to get those things done. So with that, let me open it up for your questions, thoughts, ideas, and concerns, and I will do my best to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you, Congressman. First, a tiny question and then a bigger question. Mm-hmm. And then we'll turn it to the audience. The INSERV publicizing the reports, is that, excuse me if you said this, but is that an idea? Is that in a pending bill? Has that been enacted? Where does that stand?
Well, it was a concept that we put out in response to the collisions to do that. It's an internal decision, as I understand it, with the Navy. Okay. We have suggested to the Navy that they make these INSERV or these inspection reports public. To my knowledge, they have not at this particular time. And I'll turn to Dave back there. Dave, do you know, have they done that with all the in-service reports?
That was in the FY18 NDA to have in-service public, so a portion of it is public.
Okay.
Oh, okay, great. And then I wanted to ask you about acquisition. You talked about getting away from the checklist mentality. But a lot of the things on the checklist were there for a reason, yes, like testing and independent cost estimates and making sure the contractors are charging reasonable prices. Do you have any insight into how the Pentagon should balance that? Everyone wants to get stuff done faster, sure, but you also have to make sure you don't end up wasting money and time and capability by doing it too fast.
No, listen, I agree. There's a proper speed with which to do it. The problem is that a lot of those processes are archaic. They are structured in ways that maybe worked back in the 80s and 90s but don't work today. And you talk about one of those things, testing. It's unbelievable today the testing mechanisms that are out there to be able to take a concept and run it through a virtual testing concept where you can test it thousands of times versus doing it in a laboratory. So you're trying to take, say, a model out and test things. The virtual testing element holds tremendous promise. It is shown to be extraordinarily accurate. So that truncates time that it takes to be able to make decisions. Those are things, yeah, and those are things, and remember this year, Senate Bill 104 billion, House Bill 100 billion in research and development. I would argue that's one of the places where the Pentagon needs to devote their resources to really look at modernizing how the decision-making process takes place. I don't want them to be foolish or overly zealous in getting things out, but I want to make sure that we're using the tools that we have in front of us to be able to get these things done. And I think that there's a middle ground. There's no reason why it should take 15 years to go from a concept on a 5th generation fighter to get F-35 into IOC. You can't do that these days if you look at what our adversaries are doing. And I argue along the way that there are a lot of places where you can streamline and make the decision-making process more efficient. And listen, I understand that was incredibly complex. You're trying to do 3 versions of a single aircraft, try to produce it generically with the hope of some cost savings. It's still yet to be determined whether the ultimate cost savings at the end of the program will be what was originally projected. I would argue there's been a lot of upfront dollars that were spent in addition to what was estimated that put us in a spot right now where I don't think overall in the end it'll probably be less expensive than what was projected.
Yeah, well, that was an example of one where speed hurt them in a sense because they concurrently tried to do development and production at the same time. So what you're advocating is speed in the right ways, speed in the right way.
And you bring up a great point, making sure designs are mature. And again, that's that testing element. That there's an amazing amount of opportunity out there with advanced testing, using virtual testing, data systems, artificial intelligence to really compress that time frame, come up with, I would argue, even a better result, and get to the point of production in a more efficient way.
Interesting.
Yes?
Do you have a point of view on the DIU no longer with an X and how successful maybe it's been or not?
What was that, the DIU?
The Defense Innovation Unit used to be experimental, the one that's out of Austin alongside now Futures Command. Do you see progress?
I see a little bit, but I see the problem is progress is a lot of times parochial. So you'll see certain programs. You'll see programs in the Rapid Acquisition Office in the Air Force. Very, very efficient, I would say. But then you look at other service branches trying to catch up. So I give them credit. They're looking at those like the RCO office in the Air Force, and the Navy looking at it and go, well, how do we do that? How do we get these things more quickly out there? How do we take a concept and get those things operationalized? I argue it's not just that testing, and again, we're going to really resource research, development, and engineering, but it's also making sure we do other things to make things more efficient. I'll give you a great story. We were out at Nellis Air Force Base and talking to not just the pilots there, but the Air Force maintainers. These are the best of the best, really extraordinarily talented young men and women. I was talking to a young airman there, and we were talking about the F-35. And I said, well, tell me about what you go through. And he says, sir, we've got all these systems we have to keep up. And he said, but there's one thing that concerns me. I said, well, tell me about that. He said, there's an avionics system on board this aircraft. He said, where a knob broke. He said, it was a plastic knob. He said, so I went over to my computer, and I used computer-aided design, a CAD machine, and I went ahead and designed the exact plastic knob. I sent it to a 3D printer. I printed it. And then when I went to put it on the aircraft, my tech sergeant said, Airman, you can't do that. That's not a part that's been built to the requirements of the aircraft. Now, those are the kind of things that we really need to take a step back and go, what? Really?
Army Research Lab is trying.
That's right. That's it. But that's a key. And the key is you have to be able to change that mindset quickly. You can't say, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's chew on it for another 2 or 3 years until we figure out how to do it. You have to say, hey, good idea. Let's enable folks. Let's enable folks from that third-class seaman to that private, to that lance corporal, to that airman, to engage them and say, let's let those ideas flow up and let's let that be the basis of how things, not only new concepts come into place, but what do we do with existing systems? Yes, sir.
What's the prospect on either the NDAA or defense appropriations? You know, Senator Inhofe says let's do a skinny NDAA, take it off the border, that sort of thing. Well, if you could do the same thing on the defense appropriations, maybe you could get the thing passed. Any support for that in the House?
Well, there's been a lot of back and forth. Being one of the conferees, we're continuing to have discussions to try to work through getting a complete NDAA. Because if you do a skinny one, it's just basic authorization. So anything new kind of gets set aside, any redirections. I would argue that in this time where we're devoting this amount of resources to research, engineering, and development, we better give the flexibility within that. I think it's incumbent upon us to pass the complete NDAA. That being said, if I have a choice between not passing an NDAA and a skinny NDAA, I'll take the skinny NDAA. I know that's not where the members want to be. It's been offered, I think, to try to say we are going to get something done. It's been offered, too, to maybe kind of push the issue to get the full NDA done, to get the items that are there still being discussed to be finally adjudicated and agreed upon and get into the bill. The same on the appropriations side. Things kind of took place in reverse order this year. I was a little bit concerned that appropriations took place first and then authorization. That's not the way it should be, but here's where we are. I'm hoping that this process, that the authorization informs the appropriation, and I think they're both working in parallel, so I'm not sure which one is going to predominate. I think both of them need to be done. What my hope too is that, and I don't think it'll happen unfortunately by November 22nd when the CR expires. It'd be nice if you had an appropriations bill from the Senate and from the House that you could combine, and the appropriators there could agree to put that into a minibus and at least get that passed so you take the uncertainty off the table. Because remember, the big bogey out there is what happens January 1st, 2020. We go back to BCA, the BCA 2011 numbers, and I can tell you by any measure that would be catastrophic. So there's that looming time out there that it has to be done. So if you don't get it done on the 22nd, you're going to have to get something done, I believe, before January 1st. If not, the outcome will not be good. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Should we be worried about China's rapidly growing fleet? Admiral Mike McDevitt with the Center of Naval Analysis, he said that China has 270 ships that can shoot torpedoes and missiles now, and by 2035 they will have 400 ships. By 2034 we want to have 355 ships. I mean, do these numbers matter? Should we be worried?
No, they do. Listen, I would argue that our ships are extraordinarily capable, in many instances more capable than Chinese ships. But there is a point where quantity has a quality all its own. And when you have to engage multiple targets and when you are out there and trying to get situational awareness, the larger number of ships do create a higher level of uncertainty, a higher level of complexity in that battle space. So yes, it does have an impact, which means we have to continue to develop opportunities to hold the Chinese at risk. And another thing that we have to keep in mind is this, is we have to make sure that we impose a cost on the Chinese. If you look at what we did during the Cold War with Russia, we imposed a cost on our adversaries. And I would argue it's two ways. It's making sure that we continue to place pressure on Chinese forces, that is, continue to place them at risk at longer and longer distances, which they're attempting to do to us, and in some instances being successful. But also this, the measure of our national defense success into the future is this. Are we able to do more per our unit of currency than the Chinese or the Russians do per their unit of currency? So do we do more with our dollar? And I believe we can, because we are the best creators and innovators in the world. Or do the Chinese do more with their yuan? Or do the Russians do more with their ruble? Whatever the case may be, we absolutely have to make sure we prevail there, because it will not be like the Cold War. We will not just be able to out-resource our opponents. And I am confident that we can do that, but again, it takes a change in mindset. It takes being able to, as we talked about earlier, truncate the decision-making process to be more efficient with that, to spend dollars in the right places, spend dollars to both create capacity and capability. Sometimes I think we get too bogged down in capability. Listen, capability is great, but if you can't scale that capability and you don't have capacity, as I talked about with the Chinese fleet growing, then you have the best capability in the world, but it will fail when called upon in a large-scale scenario. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Jan Support from Newsweek.
Yes.
As you know, sir, the Pentagon is the National Defense Strategy is moving towards near-peer competition
Yes.
in order to get us ready for the next war. The issue is we haven't finished our current wars.
Yes.
Under the 2001-2002 AUMFs and under 127E, under U.S. Code Title 10, we're operating in 7 different countries and
Yeah.
we speak against forces. Your late colleague, Representative Walter Jones of North Carolina, for years refused to sign any NDAA because Congress refused to hold a debate about Afghanistan. I'm sort of wondering where you come down on, when the Pentagon is shifting towards near-peer competition and getting ready for the next war when we haven't concluded our current wars.
Well, first of all, I'm in agreement with Walter as far as needing a new AUMF. I think the places that we're engaged today, we absolutely have to have the debate and say, what are we doing? The debate, the current AUMF, I think, by any measure, does not apply to the things that we see today. And listen, the challenges in the battle space there has changed. If you look at what's happening in Afghanistan, I would argue the nature of that's changed. And I go there every year, the same with Iraq, that area has changed. What's happening in the Middle East has changed. You see things happening with Saudi Arabia, with Yemen, with the Houthis, now in Syria, and all the different forces there. You see also challenges that are happening as a result of Iran's growing influence in the region. All those things, I think, require the United States to have a debate, the United States Congress to have a debate about, what should the scope of U.S. response be? What should we do to enable that? What should the policy be? Because I do think that Congress has a responsibility to define the policy. Now, I don't want to unnecessarily restrict it because obviously the situation is fairly dynamic, but you are correct. It is not just a near-peer or great power competition. It is indeed some of these other groups that I think do create an existential threat. Now you can argue, well, they're away from here, so it's not really existential. I think that it could very easily turn into that, if not today, if you look at how potentially they could pretty quickly extend the threat to places where you don't normally think about them extending that threat.
Is there a reason why Congress hasn't looked at it in terms of where it continues to sort of get kicked down to the next next Congress?
I think just because it's a difficult discussion to have, and if there was a clear place for Congress to end up, or a clear vision that this is what we need to be doing, I think it would have happened yesterday. But there is a real diversity of thoughts and opinions about what we should do. From let's pull everything back, let's just come back to our shores and leave the rest of the world to itself, to let's make sure that we are involved in every place where there is not just an existing threat or a direct threat, but a potential threat to the United States. So, and I believe that there's a sweet spot somewhere in between. I don't think that we can be inward looking and believe that somehow the rest of the world is going to go about its own and not look to threaten the United States. But again, we do not have the depth and breadth to get involved in everything around the world. So it will take a strategic discussion about where are we involved and why are we involved there, and how do we make sure that we are engaging our allies. I would argue today it's more important than ever to have relationships with other countries, because we cannot do it all ourselves. We got to make sure we help other countries ramp up their capabilities and capacity. We have to do a lot of joint training with them, because when it comes to potential threats, whether it is a terrorist threat, whether it's non-state actors, or whether it's even countries that are near peer like North Korea and Iran, it is going to take partnerships and allies to be able to effectively pursue that. The United States does not have the wherewithal nor the resources to be able to be everywhere at all times and to try to intervene in all situations. It just can't happen. But we can be a pretty powerful force when we have other allies that are willing to go with us. So I would argue it's not just the resourcing, but it's the critical nature of relationships with other countries that will define our success in the future. And, you know, one of the things that concerns me today, we talk a lot about Turkey and Syria. One of the things that concerns me today is you watch Turkey. Turkey has for the last 15 years been drifting towards the Soviet orbit and away from the NATO orbit and away from the US orbit. They've gone from a secular government to one that's not so secular. And those things, I think, are incredibly important in that region, because all you need is a little something like that to tip the balance, and then all of a sudden we find ourselves in a situation that goes way beyond what we ever thought it could be.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. When they bought the S-400 missile system from Russia, even despite there being a federal law where we could sanction them for that, we did not.
Well, let me tell you, I went there and visited with members of the legislative body in Turkey, with President Erdogan, and we were pretty forthright and said, here's the deal. You know, if you bring S-400 in, we don't even care if it's sitting in the box. If you bring S-400 in, F-35 is at risk, because we're not spending that kind of money on an aircraft to have the S-400 radar system now be able to determine what that aircraft looks like on radar. And they said, well, don't worry about it, we'll go ahead and maintain it. I said, who's going to set it up? Well, the Russians will come in and set it up. I said, yeah, that's, think again. So I think we have to be direct and straightforward. I do believe that there has to be consequences when you tell your allies that if you do this against the interest of not just the United States, but every other country that buys F-35 and the cost of that aircraft, you know, now you devalue that aircraft automatically when you bring S-400 in. So I believe the aircraft should not operate there. I believe Turkey should not be able to purchase the aircraft. And I believe, too, that, of course, and they say, well, you can't get along without Turkish companies that are doing the work there. I think the bottom line is you don't get to buy the aircraft, and the work that's being done in Turkey from your manufacturers comes back to someplace else with allies that are part of not creating a vulnerability to that aircraft for what they allow in their country.
So we're, I don't want to keep you too long,
No.
but you know, so maybe we'll take another question or two if you're up for it, but
Sure.
at least one more.
Yeah.
So.
Hey, Courtney, maybe tax. I used to be with the Virginia pilot, so familiar with your neck of the woods.
Yes.
With that in mind, you talked about Pentagon reforms needed, acquisitions, testing, R&D. How would you apply that to knowing that Newport News Shipyard is right in your backyard? How would you apply that?
Well, I think a couple of different things. One is I think that they are applying new elements of technology there. If you go to the shipyard right now, it used to be the shipbuilders would go to a big plywood table with mounds of blueprints there, and they flip through the blueprints to be able to look. Today, every shipbuilder has a tablet computer. They can go to a room where they put on a set of glasses. You can see 3D, the compartments that they're working in. So I do think that the shipbuilding industry is modernizing pretty quickly. I think that there's more that they can do. I still think that there are challenges out there as far as creating efficiencies within the process. One of the big elements, too, is workforce development. I think the states like Virginia, like Connecticut, like Rhode Island are doing a good job in restructuring their education systems at the high school level, at the community college level, to be able to pipeline students that at least come to the yard with some basic set of understanding of the skills necessary in shipbuilding, which is incredibly important because that workforce is going to grow. And one of the things we have to have is at least a basic skill set level as these workers come in, and then they can be further trained and educated there on the job. So I think that they're doing a good job. One of the areas, though, that I think really begs for attention and begs for a re-emphasis, and I think it's just beginning, but it's not where it needs to be. You know, it's great to talk about building ships, but if we're going to get to 355 ships, we're going to have to maintain the ones that we build, and especially keep the ones that are in service through their full expected service life. If you don't have a robust ship maintenance capacity there, you will not get to 355. And I'm concerned about the roller coaster ride that manpower is seeing, or manpower demands in these maintenance yards are seeing. The Navy has to be able to level load that. I know Secretary Gertz has talked about that. This should be pretty simple. You should be able to take all the data you get on repairing a DDG-51, whether it's Flight 1, Flight 2, or even when Flight 3 start to come in to be maintained. you ought to be able to take all the data there and put it into a model and say, okay, when this ship comes to the yard, we ought to be able to predict with a pretty high degree of certainty, what do we need to do? Do we need to replace that valve? Or what's the probability of needing to replace that valve? How do we make sure we have the proper workforce there? How do we make sure if we have a change order, we can do that quickly? How do we make sure we have proper inventory of spare parts so that we don't have to wait sometimes months on end for a one-off spare part to be manufactured as the ship sits in the yard, workers are waiting around or trying to do something else? We can do much better than that. I would argue it's not just the building side, but it's the maintenance side that really has to get up to speed. And we're going to continue to really push the Navy on making sure the maintenance part of their effort gets the same sort of emphasis as the construction part.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
All right, this will be the last one.
Yeah.
So where are we on trying to get Turkey to drop the S-400? It seems to be, it's not clear what we're doing and what they're going to do. And then I was speaking with an Army officer earlier today, and she expressed concern about impeachment delaying a budget, a defense budget. Do you think that's a risk?
Well, listen, things are pretty divided up there right now, and tensions are running high. So impeachment does have an impact on every other element of what happens in Congress. And to be brutally honest, yes, it will have an impact. The question is will it be past the first of the year? If it goes past the first of the year, then it's going to be extraordinarily impactful. If Congress can find its way to get at least that done before the first of the year, then I think that we will avoid catastrophe.
Which one, the impeachment or budget?
No, budget. I have no idea what the impeachment timeline is. As far as what's happening with S-400, I know that there's continued efforts to push Erdogan. Listen, Erdogan is pretty determined on S-400. And again, and that's one of those things where it's a concern because they seem to be moving more towards that Russian orbit than towards us. And I just think we have to lay the law down and say, here's the deal. You're an ally. This creates a vulnerability for us, and we have to do what we say we're going to do. We have to say, if you're not going to do this, then guess what? You will not only will you not get the F-35, but your businesses that are building parts for the F-35 will not. Now, we'll transition them out, so we're not going to yank the rug out from underneath them, but we'll transition them out. And Lockheed Martin has looked at it. They have a contingency plan in to say what happens if those Turkish companies now are no longer manufacturing parts. So they have set that up in anticipation of potentially that happening. We have to be able to give them a date certain and say, here's what we need you to do. You are an ally. You're a NATO partner. You have to do these things. If you don't do these things, this is what will happen, and this is when it will happen. And then stick to it and say, I'm sorry if you decide not to, then that's a decision that you make, but we have to move on and make a decision in the best interest of our nation, in the best interest of the F-35 program, and in the best interest of all those nations that have committed billions of dollars to buy that aircraft. It's not fair to them if we allow this to go unanswered.
Congressman, thank
John,
you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Before you go,